A man in a grey suit lies on flattened cardboard behind a Shinjuku pachinko parlor. His shoes sit next to him, laces tucked in, like he's still at his front door. Come morning, he'll fold the cardboard and clock in at 9 a.m. like nothing happened. Japan's government counted 2,591 homeless people nationwide last year, the lowest figure on record. But Tokyo aid workers say the real number runs many times higher, and it never touches the men in internet cafes down the block. This isn't a story about men who lost everything. It's about men still going to work. You'd expect losing your home to mean losing your job too. For tens of thousands of men in Japan, it works the other way around. The job is the one thing still standing, so it's the last thing they'll let go of. Start with the numbers, because they don't make sense until you see how they stack against each other, especially once you realize both sides of the comparison are being measured by the exact same government using two completely different definitions of the same word. Japan's government says fewer than 3,000 people are homeless in the entire country. 3,000. Housing charities in Tokyo will tell you at least 10,000 people are living rough in that city alone. The gap between those two numbers is the whole story, and it comes down to one word: rough. The government only counts people sleeping visibly outdoors, on a bench, under a bridge, in a park. It doesn't count the man in the internet cafe booth. It doesn't count the one renting a capsule by the month. Once you add those people back in, the picture changes fast. A 2007 Health Ministry survey found over 60,000 people sleeping in internet and manga cafes on any given night nationwide, with more than 5,000 of them living there full-time because they had nowhere else to go. Full-time in a cafe booth. A Tokyo government survey a decade later still found around 4,000 people bedding down in the capital's cafes on a single night. And the researcher who ran the survey said even that was probably too low. More recent estimates from Tokyo support groups put the number of these so-called net cafe refugees anywhere from 100,000 to 300,000 people across the country. Nobody agrees on the exact figure, and nobody's really expecting to, since plenty of these men would rather stay uncounted than show up on a government spreadsheet. Everyone agrees it's bigger than the official one. Sit with that gap for a second. 3,000 versus 300,000. That's not rounding error. That's 100 to 1. So who are these men, and why does almost none of it show up in a government count? Go back to Japan's economic bubble bursting in the early 90s. Before that, a job at a good company came with something close to a lifetime guarantee. You joined at 22, you retired at 60, and the company looked after the rest, cradle to grave. When the bubble burst, that guarantee broke with it. Companies stopped hiring for life. They hired for the month instead, on renewable contracts that could vanish with one phone call from head office. Close to 1 in 5 workers were already on temporary contracts by 1990, and that share kept climbing through the recession years that followed. These are the men Japan started calling freeters, a word stitched together from the English free and the German word for worker. Young, employed, permanently temporary. A whole generation of them ended up working full days for wages that could cover a bed, but not a lease, a deposit, and the guarantor a Japanese apartment demands before a landlord will even hand over a key. No guarantor, no apartment. That's the whole rule, and it locks out more people than you'd think. Here's what trips people up about this. These men are not unemployed. Plenty of them work full-time, every single day, on construction sites, in warehouses, behind convenience store counters. They just don't earn enough, and they can't clear the wall of paperwork a landlord requires, so an apartment stops being an option on the table. What replaces it is a 24-hour internet cafe. For around 1,500 yen a night, maybe $14, you get a reclining chair or a flat booth barely wide enough to lie down in, a locker for your one bag, a shower down the hall, and a login that doubles as a mailing address on job applications, since staffing agencies won't even consider you without one. Cheap enough to afford on minimum wage, private enough that nobody at work ever finds out. Some regulars pack their whole life into that single locker: a suit for interviews, a phone charger, spare socks, nothing else. And that's the piece that separates this from homelessness almost anywhere else on earth. Shame runs the whole system. A man who loses his apartment in Japan doesn't tell his manager. He doesn't tell his parents. He shows up every morning freshly showered in a pressed shirt, carrying a bag that looks exactly like everyone else's bag, and nobody in that office has any idea he spent the night sitting upright in a booth that smells like instant noodles and hand sanitizer. Researchers who study this population call it hidden homelessness. And hidden is the right word. It's built to be invisible, and the men living it are the ones building the disguise every single morning before the first train even runs. Support workers who interview these men describe the same pattern over and over. Fathers who haven't called home in years, sons who send a New Year card with a return address that's actually a relative's apartment so nobody asks questions. In this context, failure isn't losing your housing, failure is anyone finding out. That distinction alone explains why a population this large stayed invisible to its own government for over a decade. Some of these men manage this for years without a single co-worker noticing. They iron their one good shirt in the cafe's shared bathroom before sunrise. They keep a second pair of shoes spotless for interviews. Appearance is the whole game, because in a hiring system built around trust and reputation, looking like you belong is most of what gets you through the door. Now picture the weeks when a man doesn't even have that 1,500 yen. That's where the capsule hotels come in. And this is where the story turns almost absurd once you know the backstory. Capsule hotels were never built for homeless men. They were built in the 70s and 80s for the opposite kind of guest. The salaryman who drank too much with clients, missed the last train home, and needed somewhere cheap and anonymous to sleep off the night before showing up to work the next day looking fine. A capsule is barely bigger than a coffin, 6.5 feet long, 5 feet wide, not tall enough to stand up in. For $20 to $40 a night, it was a convenience for men who still had a home to go back to eventually. Then the recession hit, and the manager at one Shinjuku capsule hotel started noticing something he'd never seen in 20 years running the place. Guests who used to check in for one night started booking a week, then a month. Some stopped leaving at all. By 2010, at that single hotel, monthly renters made up close to a third of everyone sleeping in those capsules. And the owners quietly rolled out a discounted long-term rate because so many people needed exactly that. Some of these men even got special permission to register a capsule as their legal home address because without a fixed address in Japan, you can't easily apply for a job in the first place. A cubicle you can't stand up in became the one thing standing between a man and total unemployment. COVID tore the curtain back on all of it. When Tokyo shut its internet cafes during lockdown, thousands of men who had quietly been living in them for years suddenly had nowhere left to go. A city official announced emergency hotel rooms for what officials started calling cyber homeless residents. But the offer barely got publicized, and fewer than 700 of the thousands affected ever used it. For a few weeks in 2020, a population Japan had spent 2 decades not counting became impossible to ignore, standing outside shuttered cafes with their bags, waiting for somewhere, anywhere, to open its doors again. Reporters who showed up to cover the story found men who'd held down the same job for years, some of them commuting to that same office every single day of the shutdown, with no address to give the emergency housing form. The safety net had a form for almost everyone except them. This isn't only a Tokyo story either. Down in Osaka's Nishinari ward, an older version of the same pattern has been running since long before the internet cafe existed. Nishinari grew up around day labor. Men would gather at dawn, get picked for a construction shift, get paid in cash that evening, and either rent a bed in a cheap flophouse or sleep outside if the work dried up. No pay, no bed. That system is called yoseba, and it's basically the ancestor of the net cafe economy. Work you can lose overnight, housing built to match. The generation who built Japan's post-war cities out of that same-day labor pool are, in a lot of cases, the ones you'll still find sleeping in Nishinari's parks today, decades later, once the shifts stopped coming for good. There's a reason clinging to the job matters this much, and it isn't just about the paycheck. Japan has a word for death from overwork: karoshi. It's been recognized as a legal cause of death since the 80s, tied to punishing hours and a culture that treats leaving the office early as a kind of quiet betrayal. If a system will work a healthy man to death rather than let him rest, you can imagine what it does to a man already hanging on by a thread. He isn't sleeping in a booth because the job is optional. He's sleeping in a booth because the job is the only proof left that the system still wants him. But here's what makes this whole thing different from a typical down-and-out story. Most of these men are not looking for a way out of work. Work is the plan. It's the identity they're protecting. In a culture where your job title still gets printed on a business card and handed over with both hands, being employed is proof that you belong, that the system hasn't spit you out completely. A man sleeping in a net cafe booth who clocks in on time every single day isn't failing at the Japanese salaryman ideal. In his own head, he's living it, just from a much smaller room than anyone ever assumed he'd need. That's the part that should sit with you longer than the housing numbers do. This isn't a story about a broken safety net finally catching people as they fall. It's a story about men refusing to fall in the first place, holding on to a job with both hands even after the roof over their head is gone. Because in Japan, for a lot of these men, the job was always the roof. So which is it? A country with almost no homelessness, the way the official count claims? Or a country where tens of thousands of working men have quietly redefined what a home even has to look like? One capsule, one booth, one flattened cardboard box at a time. Maybe the honest answer is both, depending on which door you're willing to look behind. And the uncomfortable part is that from the outside, at 9 in the morning, in a pressed shirt, you'd never be able to tell which door any given man walked through the night before. He'd be standing right next to you on the platform, badge in his pocket, coffee in hand, indistinguishable from every other salaryman heading into the same office. If a story like this is the kind of thing you want more of, there's a whole world of these hidden systems still waiting to get unpacked.